Hey chess lovers and friends, welcome back to Casper Chess. Today I've put together a special collection of my favorite Queen's Gambit accepted videos for you. I noticed that many of you might have missed some of these amazing gems, so I have organized them all in one place for easy access. Stay tuned and enjoy. Before we start, we are trying to solve this problem of the Queen's Gambit declined, where white is more comfortable to play a closed position with less attacking chances for black. What I'm trying to say is that most d4 players are solid positional players who like to keep the game closed for a longer period of time and start fighting on the queen side later in the endgame. So that's one problem we want to solve. Another problem is this knight e5 move by white, which later takes away many squares. Knight e5 can be a big problem for black, and as black, we are not even sure what white is up to, whether they want to castle long maybe after developing bishop d2, or probably just to play pawn to g4 right in the opening stage, so that later on they can castle long. We don't know. Look at how slow your queen side development is. So now that you know what we want to solve, let me show you how to annoy any d4 player by turning the game into an open one and oversimplifying the position for a quick ending. So white starts with d4, then you go d5, after pawn to c4, the queen's gambit. Instead of playing knight to f6 or knight c6, the move I recommend is d takes c4, the queen's gambit accepted. Trust me, this will come as a total surprise for your opponents. And we are going to look at all of these highlighted moves in this short video. So the top played move in this position is knight c3 followed by pawn to e3, then e4, knight to f3, and queen a4 check. We are going to look at all this. So white plays knight c3. In the past decade, most black players used to play e5 in this position. I think that's just too early. The move you want to play after knight c3 is pawn to a6. Just like I advised in my last video, you can watch that after this. If black plays anything else like pawn to e3 or pawn to e4, we'll just play pawn to b5 and fix our pawn structure on the queen side. It will be very difficult for white to get back his pawn, trust me. So the top played move that you're going to see them playing is pawn to a4, not allowing you to play pawn to b5, and this is when you play pawn to e5. When you look into the masters database, there is no chess master who takes on e5. They all play pawn to d5 or pawn to e3, but just to show you what may happen after d takes e5, here you can just go ahead and exchange queens. As black, you have limited options, so you don't mind exchanging queens if you have to, as long as you're going to be up a tempo like in this case. For example, knight takes d1 by white is a wasted move. Your simple plan is as highlighted. Your queen's knight will go to c6, then later on sit on a5, and finally go to b3 to disturb the rook and the dark squared bishop. Your light squared bishop will be responsible for protecting your c4 pawn on e6, and sometimes you can also put it on f5 to win the free rook on b1. Your dark squared bishop, on the other hand, will mostly be going to b4, pinning white's knight on c3 to the king. And that's just everything you needed to know in the knight c3 line. For example, after knight takes d1, you can go knight c6 as if you want to win the e5 pawn. If they defend that pawn, you go knight a5. You already know the idea. Let's say pawn to e3, white is paving way for his light squared bishop. Now you go knight b3, double attacking the bishop and the rook. The rook can't go to a2 because the dark squared bishop will be hanging, and if rook b1, now you can play bishop f5 and you are assured of winning that rook. The game may continue as follows, and so all you need to start thinking of is oversimplifying the game, opening up the position and keeping it so simple. For example, bishop b4, remember where the dark squared bishop goes. If bishop d2 blocking the check, you just trade off pieces to simplify the game even further. Now look at how open the position is. All you need to be doing is activating your pieces. If I was to turn on the eval bar, you can see that Stockfish favors black in this position with a negative 0.1 despite being down a pawn. So for a pawn, you are up an exchange. Anyways, once again, after pawn to a4, you go pawn to e5. They don't have to take because you will simply take. Again, if knight takes d1, you remember to develop your pieces as highlighted, beginning with knight c6. And again, if knight to f3, you go knight f5. We saw what happens if pawn to e3 is played, because that allows us to play bishop f4 in the near future and win the rook on b1. But what if white plays pawn to e4, stopping bishop f4 immediately? Now this is where you can put your light squared bishop on e6. Remember, it is responsible for protecting your c4 pawn. If knight g5, maybe white wants to get rid of your light squared bishop. You have other intermediate moves like bishop b4 check. You get rid of that bishop first, and that also isolates white's pawn along the c file, and see how bad white's pawn structure is. Let's say bishop d7. If bishop e2, you go pawn to h6 and you continue playing the game normally, and this time material is equal, but white's pawn on e5 won't go anywhere, so you don't even have to bother about this pawn. On the next move, you can even castle long and start playing actively. So you can see that white doesn't have knight e5 anymore, and you are the one controlling the game from the word go. They must be responding to your threats. Anyways, all in all, in the knight c3 line, after a6, a4 and pawn to e5, you won't see many people taking on e5. For some reason, they all go pawn to d5 because they don't just want to trade off queens just yet. Now pawn to d5 stops your knight c6 and bishop e6 ideas, but at least you still have bishop b4 pinning that knight. If pawn to e4, the top played move, I mean, you can take the knight on c3, but you need to learn how to keep tension on the board to divide your opponent's attention. So this is where you can play moves such as queen h4. You simply want to take the free pawn on e4 because white's knight on c3 is pinned. If they play queen c2, you go knight f6, putting more pressure on this pawn. If they play bishop d2 and pinning their knight, this is when you can simply trade and simplify the game. Now be careful, white is attacking your important e5 pawn, so you need to defend it with knight bd7. If bishop takes c4, now this is when you can take the pawn on e4. Let's say knight f3, you have queen f4, and on the next move you castle short just like your opponent. What have you done in this position? You managed to open up the position and stopped white from occupying the e5 square, which is what they like doing in the normal queen's gambit. And where are those other moves like pawn to g4, pawn to e4? I mean, this will be a different environment for any queen's gambit player. Back to our queen's gambit accepted initial position. We just finished looking at the knight c3 line. Now what if white plays the second most played move, pawn to e3 in this position? Once again, our key move, if white allows, is pawn to e5. If pawn to e5 is not possible due to knight to f3, you want to open up the center with pawn to c5. So that's the secret move, pawn to e5 or pawn to c5. That opens up the queen's gambit position. Alright, so white just played pawn to e3. Since there's no knight on f3, you go pawn to e5 right away. The simple idea is, if d takes e5, you simply exchange queens. That's okay, because as black you don't have a lot of options. Knight c6, wanting to get back that pawn. If they defend that with knight f3, you haven't lost anything. Remember where your light squared bishop belongs, on e6 to protect your c4 pawn for good, creating more time to solidify your pawn structure on the queen side. Or if you want to oversimplify things, you can go bishop g4, pinning that knight, because on the next move you're going to win back your pawn and castle long. In this position, Stockfish still favors black. But after pawn to e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, king takes d1, and knight c6, in case white doesn't play knight to f3 to defend his e5 pawn and instead go pawn to f4, once again remember how to defend your c4 pawn. It's with bishop e6. That's all. If knight to f3, you just castle long. That comes with check. If bishop d2 blocking the check, what can you do? There are so many things that you can do here. Bishop c5 is one of them. Knight ge7, pawn to h5. But if you want, you can start your early minority attack on the center just to mess up white's pawns on the center like this. It may look like you are down a pawn or you have a weird position, but you have too many open lines for an easy endgame. Whenever white tries to win your light squared bishop for free, you can simply play bishop g8 and save your light squared bishop. If knight c3, for example, you just go bishop c5. Let's say king e2, you have rook he8, and Stockfish favors black in most of these positions. For example, if I turn on the evaluation bar once again, you can see the advantage that Stockfish gives black. You have pawn to h5 on the plate. You have pawn to b5. For example, pawn to b5 is a tricky move because if knight takes, you have this idea of planting your knight one day on g3, making white to undevelop his pieces. The whole idea of the queen's gambit accepted, you guys, is piece activity, not your pawns. Chess will be playing itself if you are putting your pieces on the most active squares. Anyways, once again, after pawn to e5 on move 3, it's not always that white will be taking your pawn on e5. The top played move is bishop takes c4, after which I just recommend that you simplify the game. If they take with their queen, you just oversimplify the game and forget about it. If they take with their pawn, you just go knight to f6. I mean, see how simplified the game is at the end of the day. You have bishop f5 in the near future, or bishop g4, and most importantly, pawn to c5, just to open up the center completely, and that will shut down knight e5 forever. At the end of the day, it is white who is going to be struggling with his isolated pawn along the d files. So yesterday I recommended starting with the queen's gambit accepted after pawn to c4. So you take, and at this point, your opponent thinks you just want to play the normal queen's gambit accepted, but the real thing is you're just waiting for them to play pawn to e4 for you to sing hallelujah. So the moment you see this move, pawn to e4, that's when you now start thinking of the Alekhine's defense, beginning with the move knight f6. So you don't want to play pawn to e5 like what everybody does, or pawn to c5. The move you want to play is knight f6, also played in the Masters database. With knight f6, you are inviting white to play e5. That's the whole idea, so that you can relocate your knight to the queen side like this, and then continue playing your Alekhine's defense lines. But I forgot to mention this, by the way. After bishop takes c4, the reason why we don't play knight b6 just yet is that maybe white may go bishop d3, and we may have difficulties developing our last squad bishop like this. You can see with your own eyeballs. Besides, you can't even take on d4, by the way, because of check. You're going to lose your queen. So that's why before playing knight b6 after bishop takes c4, you first of all develop your last squad bishop, and then once the dust settles, you go e6 followed by knight b6, the Alekhine style. So you're ready to go knight c6 next and continue developing the way you want. But not all days are Mondays. It's not everyone who's going to play pawn to e4 after you accept the queen's gambit. So sometimes white may play pawn to e3, which means you're not going to have your Alekhine's defense structure, and that's why your plan has to change. So in this case, if white doesn't play pawn to e4 back on move 3, what I recommend is just to go pawn to e5. And I'm not going to repeat this study because I already covered something like this in the video that has popped up in the card above, where you just play pawn to e5. This is also very much playable, but in the near future, I'm going to recommend something else that you can do also. So against pawn to e3, just go pawn to e5. Once again, after accepting the queen's gambit, if white plays knight c3, there are so many ways to kill a rat, one of which is a6 in this position, trying to hold on to your c4 pawn, or just go knight f6. Forget about that pawn, it's a dead pawn. We're just using it as a shield, stopping white from playing queen b3. So if they go pawn to e4 in this position, once again, you can consider playing pawn to e5, because if pawn takes, you're going to take the queen and then oversimplify the game. This also applies in the knight f3 line. I mean, after you accept the queen's gambit like this, if white doesn't play e4 and instead choose to go knight f3. Wait a second, this time you can't play pawn to e4, right? In an effort to, make white lose his right to castle. The move I recommend here is just to play bishop f5, knight f6, e6, bishop e7, just normal chess. For example, bishop f5, controlling the e4 square and also stopping white from playing queen c2. See how safe it is to develop our light squad bishop in this line, because white doesn't have queen b3 to target our weak b7 pawn. So they're going to play something like e3, targeting the c4 pawn, and then we go pawn to e6. Simple chess, bishop takes, you go knight f6. If queen b3 is played, just go pawn to b6, that's all. If castle shot is played, the top played move, you go bishop d6. but I like bishop e7. The reason is that sometimes bishop d6 may run into this simple tactic e4 and pawn to e5, especially if white's rook is already on e1 or the queen is already on e2. So just keep this in mind. That's why it's always safe to develop your dark squared bishop on e7. But in this case, bishop d6 is okay. So knight c3 may be played. Now you castle short, rook e1, you know they want to play e4 now because there are too many defenders or supporters. And so this is when you want to play knight e4, stopping pawn to e4. If knight takes, you take back with your light squared bishop, and then after knight d2 or something like that, wanting to get rid of your bishop, this is when you retreat your bishop. I mean, at the end of the day, this can just be a normal game. That's what I'm talking about. So this was just a quick recap or an addition to my yesterday's presentation. And the main area of my meat is our knight f6 Alekhine system only works after white plays pawn to e4 in the Queen's Gambit accepted. So in today's video, I want to show you something like that, which you can highly depend on even in classical tournaments, federated tournaments, and whatever you want to mention. Still against d4, and at the moment this doesn't have a name. So I'm calling it the Slav Alekhine system. You are going to love it, you guys. And I'm sure you're going to subscribe to this channel and hitting the like button. Because that's how you support this channel, right? So white starts with d4. The move that I still recommend is pawn to d5. Sometimes you can start with c6. Now listen, first of all, we want to start with the Slav defense. After pawn to c4, we always want to go pawn to c6. And goodness me, 90% of your opponents will always play knight f3. This is what they are told to play in the Slav. It doesn't matter even if they start with the queen's knight, by the way, but knight f3 is the top played move by far, even in the Lichess database. You may also start in the following way. After d4, instead of going d5 right away, you go pawn to c6, giving white an option to go back to, e4 so that you can play the Caro-Kann defense. But if they continue with pawn to c4, this is when you go pawn to d5 once again. So it's just the move order that changes. Otherwise, it's one and the same thing. So you start with the Slav, and then most of your opponents will play knight f3, the top played move, trying to control the e5 square as soon as they can. Now, in the Slav defense, the main line here is to go knight f6, but I hate this. The reason is simple. White may play queen c2 or knight c3, trying to fight for the e4 square. You don't want that to happen. So what masters are doing nowadays is what I'm going to show you guys. Instead of playing knight f6 and allow white to go queen c2 or knight c3, masters are taking the pawn on c4. So it's like playing the delayed Queen's Gambit accepted. But there's a difference. And this is what I highly recommend if you don't like my yesterday's recommendation. Very much playable even in classical tournaments, you guys. In this position, white has 4 good responses. The common one is pawn to e3. We are going to look at that. But let's start with the third common move in the Lichess database, pawn to e4. Should be the 4th common move in the Masters database. So pawn to e4. Why pawn to e4? Well, white just wants to dominate the center and also paving way for his light squared bishop to take that pawn. Now here's one thing to remember in my system. I don't like what most black players do in this position, though that is fine. Pawn to b5. The problem with b5 is that white players already know this stuff. They're prepared for this, right? They are going to, start hitting you with moves like a4, and you will concentrate much on the queen side, forgetting to develop your king side. And this is why in this particular study, I recommend that you forget about your c4 pawn. So what you want to do is this. You simply go knight f6, attacking the undefended e4 pawn, and like it or not, the top played move by white in this position is e5, because, why not? And this is when you play knight d5. Again, the same Alekhine system approach. Most likely they will take on c4, and just like we saw in the introduction, playing knight b6 may allow white to play bishop d3, stopping you from playing bishop f5 in some lines. So you first of all want to develop your light squared bishop either on f5 or on g4. I like bishop g4, by the way, putting pressure on the knight. If pawn to h3, the rule here is that when white's pawn is not on e3, it's good to take on f3 with your light squared bishop. Otherwise, bishop h5 is always a good move. So just go ahead and take on f3 as long as white's pawn is not on e3. They will take back, and then you go pawn to e6. This is now more like the French defense where white does not have knight e5, you guys. So you don't have to worry about this anymore. Imagine you are having this position in a serious tournament, you guys. You have no weaknesses or whatsoever. They may castle short or play knight c3, but you just continue with knight b6. By the way, anything is playable, even bishop e7 and then castle short. But I'm only showing you the great responses or the best responses. Why knight b6? Because you are attacking two things, the light squared bishop and the pawn on d4. So it's just a strategic move. In fact, if you check the Lichess database, you'll find that the first two moves in the database are all blunders, bishop b3 and bishop d3, because that allows you to take the free pawn on d4, which is why white has to play queen d3, defending both and allowing you to, get rid of their bishop pair, and then you continue with the normal development. That's why you played knight b6 first before playing bishop e7. Now take a look at this position. Look at how solid your pawns on the center are. This is your dream position with no weaknesses. If they start pawn storming on the king side like this, you will always and always take. Your plan is to go knight d7, knight b6, and then plant your knight on d5 forever. That will be a good outpost for your knight. So you start with knight d7. Let's say they go bishop e3, a developing move. You go knight b6, and then queen b3 since the queen was under attack, right? So you go queen d7, simple stuff. Queen d7 supports the upcoming e takes f5. So let's say pawn to g4. This is what most white players like doing, attacking. So you go king h8, getting ready to capture on f5. For example, after f5, you just take to release the tension. So they will take with their pawn most likely, and then you go rook a d8. Nothing to memorize. You're just playing safe and solid chess, just in case you see pawn to f6 in this position, because there are people who like playing like this. I mean, that would just be a losing mistake for them, because you don't even have to worry about your bishop. Tactically speaking, you will get back everything after queen takes h3. Say pawn takes, you go queen takes bishop with check, rook covers, and then you go queen g5 check, and then you grab that pawn with tempo. And that is if white tries to be aggressive with moves like pawn to f6. Otherwise, if they continue being solid like rook a d1, don't just worry about f6. Your plan is very simple. Queen c7, pawn to c5. It's up to you to come up with a better plan like this. And I just don't see any weaknesses for black in this position. It's just for you to come up with, better strategic plans like I'm showing you on the board. Nothing to memorize, just playing normal chess. Once again, after d4, d5, and pawn to c4, you don't take on c4 immediately. You can wait by first of all going pawn to c6, and you will see another advantage of playing c6 later on. This is the Slav defense. So after white plays knight f3, you don't go knight f6 like they always do. This is when you take on c4, accepting the queen's gambit at a later stage. And then let's look at one last line in the e4 line. Once again, whenever white plays e4, either in the Slav defense or in the actual queen's gambit accepted, always think of the knight f6 Alekhine's system, where they may be prompted to advance their e-pawn, and then you go knight d5. After bishop takes, knight b6 again is good, but white has bishop d3, which is why you always want to start with your light squared bishop. We saw what happens if white plays pawn to h3. I said the rule of thumb is take on f3 as long as white's pawn is not on e3. But what if white castles short first? This is another possibility, so we can't ignore it. Well, you just continue playing your normal Alekhine's defense. e6, logical moves, knight c3, bishop e7, nothing to memorize, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop b5 check, knight c6 covering the check, all logical moves. Queen a4, putting more pressure on your pinned knight, a very common move. Well, you simply go queen b6. Yep, that's how you defend your c6 knight. If bishop e3, you just take on f3. Yep, damaging their pawn structure on the king side, and then play a6 later on. Sooner or later, they are going to release the tension, and then you can even start with f6 if you want, knowing that there is no knight e5. If pawn takes, you take back with your rook. Now you have this. Say king h1. I mean, this can be a normal game at the end of the day. By the way, bishop d6 has no defense. You are about to take the free pawn on f4 and then connect your rooks as highlighted. So this is another way you can play this. So the key thing to remember in the opening stage of the Slav is delay taking on c4. Play the Queen's Gambit accepted delayed after starting with the Slav. Right. But as we know, not all days are Mondays. You won't always see this move pawn to e4, which allows you to, play your Alekhine's defense system. In fact, the top played move here is pawn to e3. And now, since white's e-pawn is not on e4, we won't have our beautiful Alekhine on the board. So we must rely on other plans. That's just how chess works. Unfortunately, there is no just one perfect system. You have to compromise. So once again, you always have pawn to b5 if you want to go back to the basics, but just never waste your time defending the c4 pawn. I mean, you will delay your kingside development. So the only thing to remember in these other lines is the development of your light squared bishop, that's all. After pawn to e3, I have two recommendations for you. To go bishop g4 and then continue playing normal chess as I showed you or as highlighted, or play this sneaky move. I would play this even in a classical tournament, you guys. In fact, when you check the Masters database, after pawn to e3 back on move 4, grandmasters play the move bishop e6, which looks unnatural. Here is the secret, you guys. Black is not defending the c4 pawn. No, the main reason for playing bishop e6 is to replace our previous d5 pawn with the light squared bishop. So we want our light squared bishop to sit on d5. In case you have forgotten where we started, here we go again. You first start with the Slav defense, but you don't go into the main line with knight f6. You take on c4, accepting the Queen's Gambit later on. And here is where we are now. White plays pawn to e3 on move 4. So instead of going bishop g4 and complicating stuff, you have this beautiful strategy to put your light squared bishop on d5 so that it becomes a bigger pawn where the d5 pawn was. This is what you must do in classical tournaments. So you go bishop e6. And there's even a little trap here, you guys. I'm looking at the Masters database right now. Look at this. White thinks you are trying to defend your c-pawn, so they are not happy with your light squared bishop. That's why the 60th common move in the Masters database is knight g5, which is an instant losing mistake, a very big blunder. Let's see in the Lichess database, maybe knight g5 is the third common move, trying to get rid of your light squared bishop, which is a blunder, you guys, because you have queen check, and on the next move you're going to win a free knight. So even grandmasters blunder like this, you guys. That's one beauty of playing bishop e6. Anyways, so let's just say white doesn't blunder with knight g5. You will see them playing something like knight bd2, trying to get back the c-pawn, or pawn to a4, whatever they want. So let's say knight bd2, trying to get back this pawn, right? The other purpose of knight bd2 is to support the upcoming pawn to e4. So if you just go bishop d5 here, just because I said we want to replace the previous d-pawn, white has this move and you'll be forced to go back. So that is again natural. You first of all start with knight f6, knowing that if they play e4, you will hold on to your c-pawn. So they will take on c4 like this. And this is when you replace your previous d-pawn with the light squared bishop. Now you have a bigger pawn on d5. Great. So after bishop d3, you may continue with your normal development. Say castle short, you can play c5, knight bd7, bishop e7, anything you want. But I like knight bd7, just meeting knight e5 in advance. Say queen e2, obviously they want to push e4, so you go bishop e4 yourself, challenging the light squared bishop. After bishop takes, you take back. Say knight f e5, they want to play pawn to f3 maybe, so you oversimplify things like this, and on the next move you castle short. Once again, take a look at the pawn structure that we saw even in the previous lines. This is your dream position. Back on move 4 after pawn to e3, and then you play the top played move in the Masters database, bishop e6, like a grandmaster, there are some lines where white may take on c4, and then after bishop d5, bishop d3, and pawn to e6, they don't castle short. They go, queen c2, intending to go e4. So in the queen's pawn game, white always wants to push pawn to e4, by the way. But here you can just take on f3, as long as the queen is not supporting the knight, and this would just be a simple game. By the way, see how I played this move, pawn to c5. When the dust settles, always think of playing c5 to release tension on the center. This is one of the key moves that you have as black. If you don't play pawn to c5 in a timely situation, you lose. So always think of pawn to c5 in the middle game. This releases tension on the center, and this is one of the ways in which the game may go or may continue. Right. So back to the Slav defense modern line position. After white plays knight f3, there's no need to go knight f6 into the main line due to queen c2 or knight c3. You always want to take on c4. White may also try to go pawn to f4. With f4, they think they are stopping you from playing pawn to b5 in advance, which you can also play by this time, by the way. But don't just focus on the c4 pawn, you guys. Just continue with your kingside development. So the move you want to start with is knight f6, your kingside development, and then white will play something like e3. Again, we are back to the e3 line, just that this time white has a pawn on a4. So once again, you have two options, either to go bishop g4 or just to go bishop e6. Bishop g4 is okay. This would just lead to a normal game like this. I don't even want to waste much of your time because this is just self-explanatory, but the main area of my interest is this move, bishop e6, on move number 5 this time. So again, if you look into the Masters database, bishop e6 is the top played move. That's what you want to play. And you already know our strategy to replace our previous d pawn with our light squared bishop. And guess what? Even in this position, there are some players who play knight g5, which is a blunder or a losing mistake due to the same tactic, queen a5 check, and you are going to win that free knight. So that's why the top played move in the Masters database in this position is to go knight a3. Just trying to get back the pawn on c4, right? And this is when you go bishop d5. That's all. So now you have a bigger pawn on d5. That's what this means. And that's why masters play bishop e6. Last time we saw what happens after knight takes is played. You can just go pawn to e6 and continue playing normal chess. But what if white takes with the bishop? Well, again, you can just go e6. That's all. If castle short, you go bishop takes. So you just took the knight. By the way, castling short is a blunder in this position or some kind of a mistake. Because if they take back, you take the free bishop. This is just one of the possibilities, by the way. So far, I've done a number of videos showing you many different responses that you can try out in order to crush the queen's pawn opening as black. Now, what other option do I have for you today? Watch. After d4, I still recommend that you go pawn to d5. Just an equal game. And then after pawn to c4, the queen's gambit, my top recommendation for today, which is my favorite of all, is the queen's gambit declined with pawn to e6. One thing I like about the queen's gambit declined is the possibility to go into the Cambridge Springs, which is not the focus for today's study, by the way. I just want to make a point. So the top played move is knight c3, after which I go knight f6. I love it when white pins my king's knight with his dark squared bishop. In fact, bishop g5 is the second most played move in both the Masters database and the Lichess database, which we want to see. So after bishop g5, the move that I recommend is d takes c4, inviting white to play pawn to e4, you guys, and you will see how trappy this line is, like for real. But before I do this, let me show you the mother of this line. So I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with the Cambridge Springs, where we go knight bd7 in this position. If white takes on d5, you can simply take back. They can't take back with their knight, thinking your king's knight is pinned. Because of this elephant gambit trap, where you take back, sacrificing your queen for the time being. Like after bishop takes, you have this move, bishop b4 check. And on the next move, you don't even have to take the queen. You first of all take the dark squared bishop so that this capture comes with a tempo on white. Just so many things are going to hang after the next move. Anyways, but this is not the main area of my interest in today's video. I just want to show you how the Cambridge Springs may go first before I continue with today's recommendation. After you play knight bd7, most white players who know better won't take on d5. In fact, the top played move here is pawn to e3. after which you continue with pawn to c6. Why? Because you want to put your queen on a5, indirectly eyeing white's dark squared bishop on g5. Now this is when white plays knight f3, or top plate moves, by the way, and you go queen a5, pinning this knight to the king as well. And once white develops his light squared bishop like this, which is a theoretical mistake, by the way, this is where we see the famous Cambridge Springs trap that begins with d takes c4, attacking the light squared bishop first, and after bishop takes pawn, we now go knight e4, putting more pressure on the pinned knight, which most of your unprepared opponents will try to defend like this, for example, forgetting that their dark squared bishop is hanging. I mean, on the next move, you're just going to be up a piece like this. So this is where I'm getting the inspiration from with regards to today's recommendation, and I just want you guys to note how we took on c4. So keep this in mind, because we are going to see something like this even in my recommendation for today. So right, I highly recommend that you play the Queen's Gambit declined with knight f6 on move number 3, inviting bishop g5. So in this position, instead of playing knight bd7, intending to go into the Cambridge Springs, you play the 6th common move in the Masters database, also played by Super GMs, d takes c4. This will come as a shock to most of your opponents, especially on leeches. For example, the top played move here is pawn to e4, like I said, because they want to play e5 and grab what appears to be like a free piece, right? Now hold on, in this position there are two lines that I recommend. The first one is what I'm calling a safer line. For example, if you're playing standard chess or a classical game in a serious tournament, you can try bishop b4, allowing pawn to e5 to happen. But the other move that you can try apart from bishop b4 in this position is pawn to c6. In fact, let's start with pawn to c6 first. The reason why I like pawn to c6 is due to the following. White will play pawn to e5 instantly, thinking they are going to win a piece or something like that. So after this move, yes, you can play pawn to h6 and g5 if you want, and then save your knight. But here is my crazy move, you guys. Simply go queen a5. Just like in the Cambridge Springs. And one of the reasons why I like this aggressive line is that white only has one correct move, only bishop d2. Any other move apart from this will be a mistake. So you're forcing your opponent to only make accurate moves by giving them an edge first. For example, if e takes f6 happens, now you can simply grab that bishop on g5. Even if they take the g7 pawn, you can just take back with your bishop, or at best, take back with your queen. This is what Stockfish says in order to maintain your advantage. Now with this move, queen takes g7, you eliminate the option for white to take on c4 because you're going to take on g2, right? Again, queen f3 will allow us to take on d4. So it's not easy for white to continue playing this position. For example, knight f3 allows pawn to b5, and it will be hardly easy for white to get back his pawn. Let's say white plays pawn to a4, maybe stopping pawn to b5, but here almost everything that you can do is fine. For example, bishop b4 is okay, very much playable, even pawn to c5 in this position, but here white can play pawn to d5. That's why Stockfish recommends that you go pawn to e5 after white plays a4. If pawn to d5 comes this time, now you go bishop b4. The thing is, if white takes on c6, they will just help you develop your queen's knight. Again, there's no bishop takes due to queen takes g2. So I just don't know. Say knight e2 is played. Here you can even take the pawn. If queen takes d5 happens, now you go knight c6. I mean, you're just playing an open game with full of possibilities. Bishop d7, castle long is also an option. I mean, even if white castles long, you can just go bishop e6. Queen e4 may be played. Now this is when you can castle short, putting your king to safety. By the way, after taking the bishop and pawn takes, the reason why we take with the queen and not the bishop is that we don't want to run into h4. So taking with the queen is justifiable. If knight f3, you just hold on to your c pawn. If pawn to a4, you go pawn to e5 and bishop b4 later on. Even against pawn to g3, by the way, you just go e5. Say if pawn to d5, you go bishop b4. Same stuff. Say this time white takes on c4. With his bishop, you just castle short and put your king on h8 on the next move. Castle shot by white runs into bishop h3, and after this, you have pawn to f5. You start pawn storming on the king's side. You just don't want to play pawn to e4, allowing white to sit on f4 just yet. Instead of e4, you can play f4 if you want. or just relocate your bishop to the king side as highlighted, or put it on f6. Once again, back to the QGD initial position. Again, after bishop g5, you just take, and if pawn to e4 is played, you will never go wrong by trying the c6 aggressive line, because after pawn to e5, you just simply go queen a5. And it's here where I said white only has one correct move, bishop d2. We saw how bad pawn takes is. You just take the bishop, and if bishop h4 is played for some reason, again that just gives you time to play knight d5, putting more pressure on the pinned knight. If knight e2 is played, maybe trying to support the other knight, the best you can do here is to go pawn to b5, holding on to your extra pawn, and maybe you're planning to go b4. For example, after pawn to g3, you just go pawn to b4. After knight takes, you take back with your c pawn like this, and look at how you expanded well on the queen side. Bishop g2, you just go knight c6, simple development, castle shot. Here I can even play bishop e7. This is okay, because if bishop takes, I take back with my knight and later on put it on f5 like we do in the Caro-Kann. By the way, this is coming, this and this. So that's why in this position, the only move that white has to play according to Stockfish is bishop d2. And I don't think most of your opponents will see this. Now, since your knight on f6 is under attack, you simply go knight d5. This is okay. If knight takes, you simply take back with your queen. If bishop takes, you simplify the game like this and play bishop b4. So they may play queen c2 or knight e2 intending to castle short once the dust settles, but you can just oversimplify the game if you want, or just leave the tension like that and castle short. This is okay. They might do the same. And now this is just a normal game of chess. You go out of the opening stage with no risks at all. You will play pawn to b5, bishop b7, knight d7, knight b6, and knight d5, given a chance. Besides, if I were you, I would even take the dark squad bishop to oversimplify things. Still looking at the c6 aggressive line. Well, this time if white doesn't play pawn to e5 and say they just take the pawn on c4, first of all, you can always gain a tempo by playing b5 and b4, which is what I like. In fact, that's what I would do in this position instead of playing bishop e7. So that after white plays bishop b3, I go pawn to b4. And once the knight moves back, that's when I can go bishop e7 if I want, or just queen a5. I don't know why I like this, but I just love this pawn structure where I allow white to take on f6 and then I go g takes f6 so that knight f3 can look useless. White won't have knight e5. So this is also playable, by the way. And this is the pawn structure that I want you guys to get used to. To me, it kind of resembles the Paris defense pawn structure. In the long run, the plan from here may be as follows. You play knight d7, bishop b7, not bishop a6. Bishop b7 kind of stops pawn to d5 by white in the near future, and then you use the open g file to attack with your rook, play h5, h4 in the near future, bishop h6 to control this highlighted diagonal, or even bishop e7 depending on the situation. So this is one way you can continue playing aggressively. So that is one line that you may try, which is the c6 line. The second option that you may try is the bishop b4 line. I love this due to its solidness. By the way, if pawn to e5 is played, first of all, at worst, you have h6 and pawn to g5 to save your knight. But the move you want to surprise your opponent with is queen d5. Look at this cheeky move, you guys. So instead of putting your queen on a5, this time it's on d5. White can take, the knight is pinned by our bishop. If they take your knight, again you take their dark squad bishop, and if pawn takes, you take back with your queen. Well simplified. By the way, queen a4 doesn't make sense due to knight c6. Equally, bishop takes c4 runs into queen takes g2. So they better play something like knight f3 here, after which you go knight c6. I don't know, but if pawn to a3, you can take or retreat your bishop. If b4, you take with ampersand. Anyways, after all, you're going to see white taking on c4. Yes, giving up the g2 pawn, knowing that they have rook g1. And you know, you can still take if you want to and bring back your queen. That's okay. But what I like doing in this position is just ignoring whatever white is doing, play bishop d7, and on the next move castle long. This is favorable for black. And that's all for today, you guys. Let me know which episode you liked the most in the comment section down below, and if at all you would love to see more of these kinds of content where I compile my favorite videos in one collection, of course, to make it easier for you guys, let me know. Now check this out, you guys. If you want to learn more about these kinds of tricks or similar opening ideas like the ones I just shared, you can watch this video that has popped up on the top left. Another video that I highly recommend you check out to skyrocket your rating is this one that has popped up on the top right. But if you love Gambit videos, you can check out the video that has popped up on the bottom left. And if you are a lover of chess traps like myself, feel free to click on the video that has popped up on the bottom right.